Did you think someone needed your garden? Sign the land waiver, you're interfering with my business. So Damien's own son kicked 68-year-old Clara out of her house while she was in the hospital. He destroyed her garden for fast food. But instead of giving up, an abandoned biology teacher bought an abandoned Victorian greenhouse in the forests of Oregon. While sorting through the rubble of the coal cellar, Clara unearthed Eleanor Vance's sealed zinc box among the 100-year-old dirt. What lay inside not only brought her back the recognition of the state, but also sealed the fate of her vile son forever. What did the 100-year-old greenhouse hide? Oregon rain hammered my face, cold, ruthless. Muscle-bound men in heavy boots loaded my walnut sideboard into the rear of a damp moving truck. Damien stood on the gravel path. His tailored cashmere coat remained spotless. He tucked his fingers deep inside dark suede gloves, shielding his skin from the autumn mist. He extended a hand. A shiny ring of brass keys dangled from his fingers, the entrance to some sterile social housing block in Portland. I ignored his outstretched palm. My feet carried me to the heavy oak entrance of my home. My rough, soil-stained palm pressed against the dry, cracked wood, tracing the layers of peeling green paint. The scent of dried thyme, floor wax, and Damien's long-lost childhood rose from the threshold. A key turned. The lock clicked, a heavy, final sound. Damien turned away. He offered no assistance as I dragged my battered suitcase toward the idling yellow taxi. The new apartment welcomed me with the harsh sting of bleach and synthetic pine cleaner. Plaster dust hung in the stagnant air. No history lived here, only blank gypsum board walls. My fingers trembled as I reached inside my pocket, retrieving the solitary heirloom salvaged from the wreck, my late husband's pocket watch. The heavy brass casing was dull, coated in a deep green patina. A hairline crack split the glass face. I set the heavy timepiece upon the cold vinyl windowsill. Under my boots, the gray linoleum remained mute, lacking the familiar, comforting groan of Douglas fir planks. I sank onto the edge of the narrow cot. Outside, the slate-gray Portland sky dripped. My ribs tightened. Without soil, without plants, my old bones would wither here, turning to dry dust. The municipal auction house smelled of sodden wool coats, stale tobacco, and decaying tax records. The room harbored a grim assembly of property speculators and silent city clerks. The auctioneer cleared his throat, announcing Lot 12, a ruined Victorian conservatory on the fringe of the old state forest. Silence descended upon the benches. No sane buyer wanted this skeleton of rusted iron. My chest rose as I inhaled the damp air. I raised my yellow card, holding it aloft with unwavering resolve. My fingers clamped around my old plastic pen, the barrel split and worn. The wooden gavel struck the podium, a sharp gunshot crack. The deed was mine. I purchased a pile of scrap metal for pennies, yet a tiny spark of purpose ignited within my chest. The glass ark greeted its new keeper with the screech of iron frames swaying in the wind. Towering hemlocks cast long, permanent shadows over the structure. Shards of old Victorian glass littered the floor, buried beneath a dense shroud of pine needles and damp moss. I stepped over the threshold. Under my heavy boots, a fallen iron rafter groaned. The air smelled of wet rot, wild blackberry vines, and a century of neglect. I approached a standing wall, placing my bare hand against the metal skeleton. Orange flakes of rust crumbled beneath my touch, drifting down like the ash of a forgotten epoch. This ruin demanded labor. Heavy, endless labor. Work commenced at sunrise. Armed with a heavy steel shovel, its ash handle split down the grain, I cleared the floor. Each scoop of broken glass rang out, a sharp metallic chime echoing under the cracked dome. My worn canvas gloves offered little protection against the thorny grasp of the blackberry briars. Sharp points punctured my skin, drawing beads of crimson which mingled with the dark forest loam. This physical ache offered a strange comfort. While clearing a rusted joint, my fingers encountered a heavy object, a handmade brass bolt. I slid the cold, heavy metal into my pocket. It became a silent promise, a seed of restoration. Nightfall drove me into the tiny tool shed. The small iron stove hummed, devouring dry pine knots. The air smelled of kerosene, warm resin, and the damp wool of my blanket. Outside, the headlights of local farm trucks swept across the clearing, their drivers squinting through the fog toward my lantern. They whispered of the crazy schoolteacher dying in her glass tomb. I paid no heed to their gossip. I brewed a bitter tea from fresh pine needles in my dented aluminum pot, cradling the warm metal. Through the rain-streaked window, I traced the steady downpour, harboring a quiet, stubborn freedom. The storm raged, but my resolve hardened. A week passed. I decided to explore the coal cellar beneath the conservatory floor. The wooden stairs shrieked under my weight, each step a dry, agonizing groan. Cold air pooled at the bottom, growing thicker, smelling of ancient moisture. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing brick walls coated in slick mold and heavy webs. Puddles of stagnant rainwater, black with coal dust, swirled around my boots. The stench of wet stone and anthracite filled my lungs. I took a step forward, the icy slurry spilling over the rims of my boots. My breath emerged in white plumes. I pushed deeper into the dark, refusing to retreat. Near the far wall, behind a mound of damp coal dust, the brickwork appeared uneven. I knelt in the grime. Using an old steel palette knife, I scraped away the crumbling lime mortar. Beneath the debris lay no stone wall, but a thick, dark oak panel. The wood was black, preserved by the dampness. I struck the timber with my fist. A hollow, resonant thud echoed through the chamber. A hidden cavity. My heart raced, its pulse drumming in my ears. I pried at the surrounding bricks, tearing my fingernails, ignoring the sharp pain. Curiosity drove my bleeding fingers forward. The final brick fell with a soft splash into the mud. I reached inside the dark, cold hollow. My fingers brushed a rigid, freezing surface. I hauled a heavy zinc box into the beam of my light. The metal was gray with oxide, smelling of lubricating grease, dry earth, and iron. I set the heavy container on the wet concrete floor. Upon the lid, elegant initials were engraved. E.V. Time had partially erased the curves of the letters. I traced the engraving, my fingertips catching on the cold ridges of the metal. My hands trembled with anticipation. The first step of a century-old secret lay before me. The padlock had rusted into a solid lump. I went to the tool shed, retrieving a heavy hammer and a cold chisel. Returning to the cellar, I set the chisel against the iron latch and struck. The metal shrieked. On the third blow, the lock fractured, iron teeth spitting across the floor. I raised the heavy lid. A dry, fragrant gust escaped, carrying the scents of a bygone century. Dried lavender, beeswax, and aged paper. This ancient perfume filled the damp cellar. I held my breath. Inside the chest, neat bundles lay wrapped in yellowed wax paper, preserved from the damp air. I lifted the first object, a leather-bound journal. The brown cowhide was split along its binding, its corners reinforced with tarnished brass. Gold lettering on the cover remained legible. Eleanor Vance, Diary of Observations, 1889. I opened the first page. The floorboards under my boots groaned as I shifted my weight. The paper was thick, creamy, bearing the faint lines of an old watermark. The brown ink had faded, yet the elegant cursive script remained clear. The leaves smelled of pressed herbs, library dust, and decades of silence. Eleanor's words detailed the native flora of Oregon and her hidden lab inside this very conservatory. Beneath the journal lay several glass tubes wrapped in cotton. Red sealing wax capped each vial, stamped with Eleanor's personal crest. I picked up a tube. Through the dust-coated glass, I discerned tiny, dark, oval seeds. They appeared dead, yet I trusted the resilience of nature. The handwritten label read, Rosa Oregonensis coalestis, Oregon Blue Rose, 1891. I pressed the cold vial against my collarbone. The past held more than dry memories. It held the seeds of life, capable of altering my future. Damien burst into the glass arc on a rainy Tuesday morning, breaking the quiet with the sharp tap of his leather shoes upon the damp floorboards. His presence brought the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne, an alien intrusion in this space which smelled of wet earth and oxidized iron. He tossed a packet of glossy documents onto my soiled wooden workbench. He demanded the immediate cancellation of my lease. Damien offered a sleek pen of polished black resin, his posture rigid and commanding. I refused to touch it. Instead, I ran my rough palm over the dusty wooden surface of the workbench, tracing the old, hardened runs of carpenter's glue. I discerned the anger burning in my son's gray eyes, yet his loud insistence masked a deep, desperate terror hidden behind his usual arrogance. During our argument, Damien reached inside his wool coat, pulling out a cigarette. His fingers shook violently. He fumbled, missing the small metal wheel of his polished chrome lighter. The heavy lighter slipped from his hand, falling with a metallic ring onto the ancient stone floor where gray lichen grew. He froze, his mouth opening as if to speak a simple word, but his jaw locked, his face contorting in a brief, silent spasm. I slowly bent down. My fingers gripped the cold chrome steel of the lighter, and I returned it to his trembling palm. I peered into his narrowed pupils, examining the dry skin around his temples. My biological training whispered a warning. This was no mere exhaustion. The cool air of the greenhouse, heavy with the scent of damp pine needles, seemed to freeze around us. Damien snatched the lighter, spun on his heel, and retreated into the rain, leaving me with a heavy weight of anxiety and a dark foreboding. The next morning, I traveled to the Central Portland Library. The grand stone building welcomed me with a solemn silence, smelling of decades of dust, decaying animal glue, and yellowing paper. I made my way to the historical manuscript room, choosing a heavy oak table scarred by the nibs of 1,000 steel pens. The elderly archivist brought a heavy stack of leather-bound folders tied with frayed cotton ribbons. As I untied the first knot, a cloud of fine gray dust rose into the air, forcing me to blink. I opened the initial folder, carefully turning the brittle, flaking pages of the late 19th century Oregon land registries. Every dry rustle of the paper echoed in the vast room, carrying me deeper into the history of the forgotten forest and the hidden life of Eleanor Vance. My fingertips, coated in black archival dust, slid along the elegant cursive lines written in faded iron gall ink. I examined the original boundary deeds of the forest surrounding my greenhouse. The old paper smelled of dry cellars and ancient parchment. On a page dated December 1894, I discerned a strange discrepancy in the dates and signatures. Eleanor Vance's signature on the main transfer deed appeared unnaturally straight, lacking her usual fluid curves, as if traced over carbon paper. Beside her name stood a heavy red wax seal bearing the Sterling family crest, the ancestors of my late husband. I gently touched the cracked red wax and several brittle flakes crumbled under my fingernail. The dark, buried pages of our family history were beginning to open. I unrolled a massive, crackling canvas map of the state forest from 1895. The heavy fabric resisted my hands, attempting to curl into a tight roll. To hold the stiff edges down, I placed heavy bronze paperweights, shaped like lion paws, on each corner of the table. The canvas smelled of dried linseed oil and river mud. Tracing the faded ink boundaries with my finger, I discovered a crucial detail. The governor's decree of 1892 had granted the entire tract surrounding the glass arc to Eleanor Vance for her exclusive, perpetual use. This land could never be legally sold to private developers. On the old hand-drawn schematic, the greenhouse was labeled Vance Botanical Laboratory. The historical truth emerged beneath my hands, undeniable and solid. I moved to the medical records section of the archives, requesting the personal files of the Sterling family. The clerk brought several heavy gray cardboard boxes, coated in the soot of the old coal furnace which once heated the building. The boxes smelled of mothballs and drugstore dampness. I lifted the heavy lid, revealing neat folders of family medical histories spanning 3 generations. I pulled out a yellowed ledger bound in gray cloth, the personal journal of the Sterling family doctor. Under my wooden chair, the floorboards gave a sharp creak as I leaned down, deciphering the cramped Latin script. A terrible family inheritance lay recorded upon these pages, a curse passing from father to son. I turned the leaf, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The doctor's entries from the winter of 1951 detailed the agonizing decline of Damien's grandfather. The symptoms were recorded with clinical precision: a progressive loss of muscle control, slurred speech, a persistent tremor, and total physical collapse over several years. The physician noted this specific pathology targeted only the male heirs of the Sterling line upon reaching middle age. The paper beneath my fingertips felt like ice. I remembered the slow, painful decline of my own husband, and I recalled Damien's childhood terror of sharing that fate. The disease had not spared my son. I quietly closed the journal, the faded gray cloth rustling against the oak table. This tragic record explained his desperate greed. He was running out of time. Returning to my tool shed, I found a glossy pamphlet on the old oak dresser, among the dusty jars of dried seeds. Damien had dropped it during his angry visit. The paper was thick and glossy, smelling of heavy, expensive printing ink, a sharp contrast to the rustic textures of the greenhouse. Under the humming kerosene lamp, I examined the pages. The text detailed an experimental gene therapy program in a Swiss clinic, designed to treat neurodegenerative diseases. The price was $3 million. The picture became clear: his frantic haste, the forced sale of my cottage, his desire to destroy my laboratory. My son was trying to buy his survival, completely unaware his salvation was closer than he imagined. Deep in the quiet of the night, I reopened Eleanor Vance's diary. The rough, yellowed pages rustled softly under my fingers, releasing the scent of dried lavender and old leather. I turned to her entries from August 1890, written in a hurried, passionate hand. Eleanor described her experiments extracting an active lipid compound from the petals of the blue rose. She claimed this oil could rebuild the damaged myelin sheaths of nerve cells. I touched the margin of the page where she had drawn intricate chemical diagrams and distillation schematics. Dust motes danced in the warm glow of my oil lamp. This century-old journal, written by a forgotten woman, contained a complete formula for a natural cure, far superior to the expensive Swiss trials. I walked to the wooden table where the glass tubes of blue rose seeds rested upon a piece of faded velvet. I picked up one of the vials, enjoying the weight of the thick Victorian glass and the rough texture of the red wax seal. Inside, the tiny, dark seeds rustled like sand. They appeared dead, yet within their dry shells slept the power to save Damien. I gently wiped a thin layer of century-old dust from the glass. The smell of the sealing wax mingled with the kerosene of my lamp and the wet earth outside. I understood my purpose. Destiny had not brought me to this ruin for my own peace, but to save the child who had so cruelly betrayed me. The following afternoon, while reviewing old legal records in the library, I discovered a brittle, yellowed parchment envelope bearing Eleanor's personal wax seal. The old paper crackled like dry autumn leaves under my touch. Inside lay an official accusation of intellectual theft, filed by Eleanor against Thomas Sterling, Damien's great-grandfather. Thomas, the forest manager of the time, had stolen her early research and the blueprints to sell them to a commercial firm, leaving Eleanor ruined and forgotten. The Sterling fortune was built upon her stolen intellect. I held the ancient paper, experiencing a sharp chill as the generational circle closed. The family curse was the price of their ancient theft, and it had returned to claim Damien. I sat in the deepening twilight of the glass arc, placing 2 items upon my workbench: Eleanor's leather-bound journal and my husband's patinated brass pocket timepiece. The old timepiece ticked with a slow, heavy rhythm, counting the precious hours slipping away from my son. I laid my palms upon both objects, comparing the different textures, the cold, smooth metal of the clock and the warm, cracked leather of the diary. The ancient lie of the Sterling family and the tragedy of Eleanor Vance met in this quiet greenhouse. Beneath my boots, the old floorboards creaked in the silence. I possessed the truth, and I was ready to fight for my son's life and the memory of Eleanor. At dawn, the first buds of Rosa oregonensis coalestis parted. I knelt on the damp earth before the fragile stalks, my breathing suspended. Pale blue petals unfolded like morning fog rising off the Columbia River. I lowered my face, drawing in the heavy scent. It was dense, sharp, rich with pine needles, wet loam, and wild honey. With my fingertip, I touched the velvety curve of a single petal. Life pulsed beneath the delicate blue skin. The floorboards beneath my knees groaned soft approval, breaking the morning silence. Eleanor Vance's rose had awakened from its 100-year sleep. This blossom carried the cure, a sole beacon of hope to save my failing son. To extract the oil, I assembled the antique copper distiller salvaged from the coal cellar. I spent hours rubbing away the green patina and dark soot with a soft flannel cloth. Gradually, the copper gleamed with a warm, golden glow, reflecting the weak morning light. The apparatus smelled of vinegar, cold metal, and bygone eras. I fitted the fragile, hand-blown glass tubes together, listening to their high-pitched ring. I struck a match, igniting the brass burner. Soon the water inside the glass retort bubbled, swirling with the blue petals. A steam of boiled herbs and sweet oil filled the greenhouse, chasing away the scent of damp mold. I worked with meticulous care, following Eleanor's ink sketches, joining a long chain of caretakers. A heavy, viscous drop of brilliant azure oil formed at the tip of the glass tube. It clung to the glass, swelling, before plunging into the bottom of a small crystal flask. I held my breath. The vessel, once belonging to Eleanor, retained the faint aroma of dried rosewood. Drop by drop, the azure liquid filled the container, catching the morning sunbeams in a display of liquid sapphire. I cradled the crystal flask in my palm, noting its heavy weight and the cool sharpness of its cut glass. This oil possessed the power to halt Damien's creeping paralysis. A quiet triumph settled over me. My son would live. I walked to the black rotary telephone mounted on the wall of the tool shed. The heavy box, fixed to a cracked fir panel, smelled of ancient bakelite and dusty wiring. My index finger trembled as I spun the metal dial, listening to its slow, mechanical whir. The line hummed, ringing twice before Damien's dry, flat voice sounded in the receiver. "What do you want, Mother?" I spoke quickly, my words stumbling over the blue rose, Eleanor's diary, and the cure. I implored him to visit as my son, not as a businessman. A long silence stretched across the wire. A cold, mocking chuckle cut me off. The line went dead with a harsh click. In his high-rise office in Portland, Damien slammed the receiver onto its cradle. His right hand shook, fingers twitching against the plastic. Panic seized him. The words of his mother sounded like the ramblings of a senile woman desperate to save her pile of scrap iron. On his polished desk lay the franchise agreement, requiring the immediate demolition of the greenhouse. His investors demanded action. Damien picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. His fingers failed to grip the metal, dragging across the white parchment and leaving dark, ugly blots of ink. Fear of his father's fate burned in his chest. He pressed the intercom, calling his attorney to execute the eviction order with police assistance. The roar of heavy truck engines shattered the quiet of the state forest. Tires spun on the wet gravel. I stood by my workbench, my muscles freezing. Men in bright yellow hard hats and two uniformed officers marched through the door, led by Damien's slick attorney. Their heavy, steel-toed boots stomped over the baby sprouts I had planted in the dirt floor. The old wooden door slammed against the iron frame with a splintering crack, raining century-old dust and dried putty onto our heads. The attorney clutched a leather folder bearing a court seal. I pressed Eleanor's leather diary against my ribs, my knuckles turning white with terror. The attorney read the court order, declaring me mentally unfit and demanding the immediate clearing of the public land. His voice remained flat, dry, indifferent to my protests. I gestured toward the blooming blue roses and the copper distiller, speaking of the cure for Damien, but the officers only exchanged pitying glances. A worker stepped toward my oak workbench. With a sweep of his arm, he sent my glass jars and old biology books crashing to the stone floor. Clouds of gray dust and dry paper fragments exploded into the air. I lunged forward to shield my instruments, but two thick hands grabbed my shoulders, pinning me in place. The workers swung their heavy steel crowbars. The beautiful Victorian-stained glass, which I had spent weeks cleaning, shattered into thousands of pieces, raining down like sharp ice. A cold wind rushed through the broken frames, bringing the scent of pine needles and freezing rain. Dust from the old iron rafters swirled around us. The groan of the bending metal frame sounded like the scream of some dying beast. I screamed as the glass ark, my sanctuary built from ruins under the Oregon rain, crumbled before my eyes. The destruction of my world was absolute. A worker shoved the heavy copper distiller off the table. The apparatus crashed to the floor, the glass tubes shattering with a sharp pop. The crystal flask containing the blue oil fractured, and the thick blue liquid spread over the concrete, soaking into the dirt and gray dust. A powerful fragrance of blue roses filled the damp air, a sweet scent of ruined hope. I dropped to my knees, scraping at the concrete with my bare fingers, trying to salvage the blue oil, but the liquid disappeared into the deep cracks, leaving only sapphire stains on the gray stone. The foreman, wearing mud-slicked boots, walked toward the central terracotta pot holding the primary Rosa oregonensis coalestis. With a heavy kick, he shattered the century-old clay vessel. The soil crumbled, exposing the pale, twisted roots. The man stomped his boot onto the delicate blue buds, grinding them into the wet mud. I reached for the broken stem, but the sharp thorns sliced my fingers. Warm blood welled from my skin, mixing with the dark soil and the blue sap of the crushed rose. The cure for my son lay destroyed, ground into the earth by his own command. The officers hoisted me up from the muddy floor. My hands were slick with blood, dirt, and blue oil. I tried to hold on to Eleanor's diary, but my bloody fingers slipped from the leather cover. The attorney smirked, snatching the book and sealing it inside a clear plastic evidence bag. Steel handcuffs clicked around my wrists with a cold, definitive bite. They led me out of the ruined conservatory into the freezing downpour. I walked toward the police car, my skin shivering, destined for a sterile psychiatric ward in Portland. Through the rain-streaked window of the patrol car, I watched the glass arc fade into the gray mist. Empty space opened in my chest. The work of my hands was gone, but as the car accelerated down the highway, a faint warmth pricked my palm. I carefully uncurled my fingers beneath the long sleeve of the hospital coat. Pressed against my skin lay a single, undamaged blue petal. The petal smelled of wild honey and Eleanor Vance's iron will. I smiled through my tears, realizing the seed of our survival remained safe in my hand. Inside the sterile white hospital ward in Portland, a profound calm settled over me. The physicians quickly recognized my perfect mental clarity. Sitting by the window, I held the solitary sky blue petal in my palm. It had dried over the days, turning thin and delicate, resembling ancient papyrus. It smelled of fading autumn, yet it harbored the secret of life. The chief physician signed my discharge papers with a soft rustle, offering a quiet apology for the misunderstanding. I carefully slipped the fragile petal inside my old leather purse, its worn edges smelling of copper coins and dried lavender. I was free. My mind operated with a sharp, crystalline focus. I was ready to deliver the decisive counterstrike. Meanwhile, beneath the shattered dome of the glass ark, the greatest secret remained undisturbed. In their haste to demolish the greenhouse, Damien's workers had failed to lift the massive basalt flagstones laid deep within the foundation during the 19th century. Far below these heavy stones, in the damp, cool Oregon soil, rested the massive mother root system of Rosa oregonensis coalestis. I understood this ancient root, growing deep in the earth for over a century, could never be destroyed by a crude raid. The soil beneath the stones smelled of decaying pine needles, wet granite, and ancient endurance. The root continued to drink the groundwater, biding its time, ready to push fresh green shoots through the stone crevices to reveal its sky-blue blossoms once more. Prior to the attack, I had anticipated my son's treachery. I had wrapped Eleanor Vance's original journals and the university's chemical analysis in thick brown paper, which smelled of tar and heavy jute twine. I sealed each parcel with hot red wax, using an old brass stamp from the United States Forest Service. I dispatched these packages via express mail to the federal agency's main office. The thick cardboard casing successfully protected the invaluable manuscripts from the rain. Now, federal lawyers and scientists held irrefutable proof of the historical and ecological value of the glass ark. I had constructed a legal shield which Damien's lawyers could never breach with their municipal demolition orders. Our meeting took place in the opulent office of a prestigious Portland law firm. The spacious room featured dark walnut panels, which groaned slightly under the autumn drafts. The air smelled of expensive leather, old wool cloth, and beeswax. At the center of the room stood a massive table of polished mahogany, reflecting the warm glow of a brass chandelier. Upon the surrounding shelves stood rows of legal treatises bound in aged calfskin, covered in a beautiful patina of age. In the corner, a tall grandfather clock ticked with a slow, hoarse rhythm. Damien sat in a plush leather armchair, leaning heavily upon his cane, confident this meeting would sign the final demolition of my sanctuary. Damien appeared utterly spent. His skin was pale, and his right hand, resting on the mahogany armrest, trembled in a slow, continuous rhythm. To hide the tremor, he squeezed the silver handle of his modern cane with white-knuckled intensity. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes burned with a feverish, desperate intensity, realizing his time was running out. Beside him sat his wealthy investors, dressed in tailored suits, casually flipping through glossy brochures of his fast food franchise. These men failed to detect his creeping paralysis, perceiving him only as a vehicle to seize the valuable forest land. Damien waited for me, eager to execute the paperwork and depart for his Swiss clinic. The heavy door opened with a slow creak, and I stepped into the room. I wore my simple canvas work coat, which smelled of forest wind and dry pine needles, a sharp contrast to the sterile, manicured luxury of the office. I walked slowly to the table, placing my old, scratched leather folder upon the polished mahogany. The impact sent a tiny plume of dust into the air, smelling of archives and dried herbs. I sat directly opposite my son, my spine straight, showing neither fear nor resentment. I opened the leather folder, and the dry rustle of the old parchment caused the attorneys to tense. I withdrew the first document, a thick sheet of parchment bearing intricate watermarks and the gold seal of the United States Forest Service. The paper crunched under my fingertips like a dry autumn leaf. This was a long-term federal lease, granted directly to me based on the unique scientific value of the conservatory. The Forest Service attorney, sitting by my side, calmly explained this document, nullified any municipal demolition orders. The land was now officially recognized as a protected federal reserve. Damien's attorney turned pale, his fingers sliding uselessly over the text of the lease. The glossy franchise plans on the table instantly became worthless waste paper. Next, I placed a crisp white sheet of modern paper before Damien, a medical evaluation from the Portland State Commission. This clean, white page stood out sharply against the worn leather of my folder. The document confirmed my perfect mental health and legal competence. Every power of attorney Damien had used to claim my insanity was now legally void. The sale of my Victorian cottage was frozen by a court order pending an investigation into his fraud. I faced my son with deep maternal grief. Damien focused on the papers, and his trembling hand slipped from his cane, falling with a dull thud onto his knees. His complex conspiracy collapsed in a matter of minutes, leaving him with nothing. I opened Eleanor Vance's leather journal to the pages detailing the Sterling family's genetic disease. The dry binding creaked in the silence, releasing the aroma of old ink and lavender. I read the descriptions of the symptoms his grandfather suffered before his death, and then I laid copies of Damien's own Swiss medical records onto the mahogany table. The investors whispered in shock. The secret was out. I proved Damien had concealed his terminal illness from his partners and had attempted to illegally seize federal land to finance his unauthorized Swiss treatments. His professional reputation was ruined. The ancient lies of the Sterling family lay exposed before strangers. Damien's investors rose from their seats without a word. Their disappointment was cold and swift. They gathered their glossy brochures, which now smelled of failure and deceit. None of these men wanted any connection to a bankrupt developer facing federal fraud charges. Their footsteps echoed on the parquet floor, and the heavy oak door closed behind them with a definitive click. Damien remained alone in the massive leather chair. His silver cane slipped to the carpet, and he buried his face in his shaking hands, a quiet, ragged sob escaping his throat. He had lost his business, his status, his money, and his last hope for survival. I rose slowly, walked around the table, and placed my rough hand upon my son's trembling shoulder. From my coat pocket, I withdrew a small wooden box lined with faded velvet. Inside rested a small crystal vial containing the pure, sky-blue extract I had harvested from the hidden mother root. The vial smelled of fresh earth and pine needles. "I will save you, Damien," I spoke softly, setting the crystal vial before him. "The medicine belongs to the Federal Reserve, but as its discoverer, I possess the right to treat you without cost." Damien raised his tear-filled eyes, perceiving the azure oil he had so brutally tried to crush. 6 months passed. The restored glass arc gleamed under the foggy canopy of the Oregon forest. New stained glass panels chimed in the autumn wind, and hundreds of sky-blue roses bloomed inside the warm structure. Damien, cured of his physical affliction but stripped of his cold arrogance, worked in the soil. His hands, once covered in expensive suede, were now stained with dark earth. He carefully tied the young shoots of the blue roses, listening to the familiar creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I studied him from the shadows of the ferns, experiencing a deep, melancholic peace. Justice had triumphed. My son was saved, and his pride was forever defeated by the quiet power of the earth and a mother's love.